Good morning and welcome. We are now live with our very special Q&A today. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Anna Blanco, and I am the Executive Director of the International Ocean Film Festival. And it's my pleasure to welcome everyone to 5 days left of the International Ocean Film Festival. We've been celebrating 18 years of bringing ocean-inspired films to our audiences. And this year we featured 18 days of films to celebrate our 18 years of as an organization and as a film festival. So we're very excited that you can join us today. We have a very special panel discussion, and we're excited to hear more about Mako Sharks, and specifically about Mako Sharks, King of the Pelagic Realm, which is one of our films in this year's film festival. So I encourage everyone to submit a question. We have some very distinguished guests today, so don't miss your chance to send us your questions. Also include where you are calling in from. We love to know what kind of a global audience we have. At last count, we had over 22 countries participating in the film festival this year. And I'm sure there's a few more countries as well. So thank you for participating and thank you for joining us. And if you haven't had a chance to see the film yet, I strongly encourage you to do so. It's exciting to learn more about Mako Sharks, and I guarantee you, you're going to learn a lot today with our distinguished guest. I'm going to pass it over to Ian Campbell of Project Aware. He's the Associate Director of Policy and Campaigns, and we are excited to have him joining us from the UK to be our guest moderator today. So without further ado, it's all yours, Ian. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anna, and good morning, afternoon, good evening to wherever you are joining us from. Those of you joining our Q&A session on Mako Sharks, it's a species of shark that not many people know much about, as when compared to some other shark species. When we speak to people, you know, some people may have heard of Makos and they might realize they're the fastest species of shark in the sea, but not a lot of people understand much about these species. I'm really pleased and honored to have been asked by Anna and the International Ocean Film Festival to moderate this session, and especially to be joined virtually by my two guests, very highly esteemed and knowledgeable people. We have Shawn Heinrichs, whose film is in part of the festival, and Lee Crockett from the Shark Conservation Fund. So before we kick off, let me tell you a bit about myself. Expand on Anna. I'm the Associate Director for Project Aware. Who are Project Aware? I virtually hear you ask. We are a small NGO that were formed by the PADI, the Professional Association of Dive Instructors, about 30 years ago, and we're now an ocean conservation organization working across the globe on many marine conservation issues, and sharks is a huge component of our work, with Makos in particular a species of concern that we're focused on. We're joined, thankfully, by the Emmy Award-winning cinematographer, wildlife photographer, and ocean activist Shawn Heinrichs, whose film Mako Stronghold is part of this the Shark Conservation group of films, and he's also a unique individual in that he's probably one of the very few people on the planet that's actually swum with a Mako shark in the wild. And also with me, we've got Lee Crockett, the Executive Director of the Shark Conservation Fund. Now, Lee oversees all of their portfolio of shark conservation work all around the world, and has been responsible for supporting many of the shark conservation efforts that are happening globally. And prior to that, Lee has got a distinguished career working in fisheries and conservation. So welcome, Shawn, and welcome, Lee.
Thank you.
So I'm going to kick right off with some, being moderator, I get to control the questions and ask some questions of myself first. So Shawn, the film is showing basically your Mako Stronghold, which is, I've rewatched it. I've seen it when it first came out. It's got some stunning visuals. What have you done to drives you to make a film about a little known species of shark? That when you look at pretty much any other underwater shark film, it focuses on great whites or some of the other charismatic species. What's driven you to kind of to make this film on Makos?
That's a great question, and I think it actually started not with a live Mako shark, but dead Mako sharks. I've spent the better part of 2 decades in and around the world, Southeast Asia, Africa, Central America, and basically a lot of these ports and places where you're bringing in a lot of wildlife, a lot of marine wildlife. And one of the things I noticed in all these ports is a lot of sharks coming in. And over the years, you know, what you've noticed particularly is sharks are getting smaller and smaller, and certain species are starting to disappear from these ports. And in particular, what I noticed in the early days of my investigations was I was seeing a lot of large Mako sharks, really large, pregnant, either pregnant or sexually mature females. And they're quite formidable sharks, and you got to even imagine the work to even bring something like that in. But as time passed from port to port, what I noticed is there were less and less Mako sharks, and they were getting smaller and smaller. And I had to ask the question, what was happening to these species? And when you did some research, it became pretty evident what was happening. They were being hammered in the tuna longline fisheries. Not necessarily as a direct target, but largely as a bycatch, because the fact of the matter is sharks don't know that they're not meant to bite tuna hooks. You know, baited hooks are a target for any species. And in addition to the target species like tuna, you're getting sharks and turtles, you're getting marlin, you're getting swordfish and all kinds of other species. And it was pretty sad to think that one of the most charismatic and formidable sharks in the oceans, I'd never met one alive. And so when the opportunity came up to actually meet one of these sharks and help protect it, which was the possible listing of Makos in the 2019 CITES conference, we had a little bit of wind time, and we had a coalition that said, hey, let's get behind this and see if we can get these animals protected. And so we zoomed off to New Zealand and worked with shark scientist Riley Ellett. And the opportunity was to jump in the water and tell their story.
Thanks. And Lee, turning to you, Executive Director of the Shark Conservation Fund. Lots of people have heard when they look at shark conservation, some of the big, well-known NGOs, but many might not have heard of the Shark Conservation Fund. I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of a flavour of how the Shark Conservation Fund came into being and the kind of work that you're doing.
Sure. Well, we're a coalition of philanthropists who pool their money to fund shark conservation work around the world. So the idea is that by working together and pooling their funds, they can leverage and have a greater impact. And so our two kind of main focuses are, you know, the biggest problem with sharks generally around the world is overfishing. And often that takes place on the high seas, or it takes place in a developing country. And so then the question arises, how do you get a developing country to care about its sharks when it has many other problems to worry about? And as many people know, the most valuable part of a shark often is its fins, and that led us to using CITES, the Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, a mouthful. But species that are listed on Appendix 2 of CITES, to be able to trade those species, a government or a country is going to have to demonstrate that the trade is not detrimental to the species in the wild and the ecosystem it comes from. And so if a country is not managing its sharks, or if they're doing a poor job of it, that non-detriment finding is going to be difficult to make. So that opens up a door for us to support NGOs that come into those countries and help them develop shark management measures, develop the information, you know, about the catch, the health of their resources, the technology for, you know, developing management measures and enforcement, all that kind of stuff. So we fund work right now in 20 countries around the world, implementing these CITES listings, and it's all through improving fishery management. I mean, listing a species on CITES is the first step. But to be able to actually have an impact on the water, those listings have to be implemented, and that's through fishery management. And the other thing that we're working on is preventing extinctions of endemic sharks that are endemic to a particular area and threatened with extinction. So if you map those out on a map of the world, you see the Coral Triangle, China Sea, Southwest Indian Ocean, Southwest Atlantic Oceans are kind of hot spots for endemic sharks that are threatened with extinction. And we're funding efforts to get those species legal protections as a first step there. So those are the kind of work. And so we were supporting, along with one of our partners, the Paul G. Allen Family Foundation, the CITES listing work that happened in 2019 in August that listed Makos there. And then we've been supporting work by you, Ian, and your colleagues to improve Mako management at the International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tuna. So this is a regional, what they call RFMO, or Regional Fishery Management Organization. And that group manages fisheries on the high seas in the Atlantic Ocean. So,
you know,
right, too much probably.
No, not at all. You've shattered the illusion of us not knowing we're collaborating together. But it's true. So Project Aware, where we're working on trying to reduce the overfishing of Mako sharks in the North Atlantic, where populations are crashing, and it's been through the support of Shark Conservation Fund, which is helping form coalitions. We have a coalition called the Shark League, which is looking at pushing that. But I'd also maybe, Lee, if you'd like to expand. I know a lot of us who work in the conservation movement, where we often talk in acronyms and language that isn't necessarily kind of easy to layman. If you just want to explain what CITES, just the general what CITES is. I know it's
sure.
Some people have heard of it and not understand what it is.
Yeah, it's so like I said before, it's the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. So it was adopted in the early 70s. So it's one of the oldest international conservation measures. And there's 183 parties to it. So the global scope is pretty impressive. And there's 3 appendices that of the CITES convention. And the first is Appendix 1, which is, well, I should backtrack a second. Basically, CITES controls trade. So it only impacts trade of species. And so species can be nominated to be listed under various appendices. So Appendix 1, if a species is listed on Appendix 1, that's a trade ban. You can't, they can't be traded at all. On Appendix 2, it's regulated trade. And it gets back to what I was saying before with Makos. There's, if a species is listed on Appendix 2, to be able to trade it, a country's going to have to develop one of these non-detriment findings, which
to prove they're doing it sustainably, kind of a
prove that the trade is not detrimental to the species in the wild or the ecosystem it comes from. And then finally, there's Appendix 3, which is species that are in trouble in a particular country, and that country needs some help from other countries managing it. So the beauty of CITES is it's one of the few conventions that has legal teeth to it, so that if a country is found to be violating CITES, they can put a trade ban in on all CITES species from a particular country. So it wouldn't be just sharks, it'd be any other species there as well. And just, you know, that potentiality really makes countries pay attention to it. And so it's you know, it's a strong legal mandate that we were trying to use for shark conservation. And obviously you folks on my colleagues here have been very involved in that as well.
And Shawn, I have a question for you from myself. I know that your film originally was designed to kind of help promote the Mako listing on CITES, but I've heard you speak previously about, I don't want to paraphrase you, but is it using inspiration to drive conservation?
Yeah.
And what I want to ask is, can you tell us sort of about how you try to connect people to animals that they may never have even encountered or heard of? That, you know, what's the process you go about to kind of formulate that connection when you're doing a storytelling piece?
Yeah, I often think of sort of the 3 enemies of conservation is ignorance, apathy, or greed. Ignorance is you just have no idea. Apathy is you know about it, but you think someone else is going to take care of the issue. You know, it's not my problem. And then greed is I know exactly what I'm doing, but I'm profiting from it. And when it comes to species conservation, they often are, a lot of these species are out of sight, out of mind, particularly ocean species. And in the case of sharks, and particularly Mako sharks, not only are they generally out of sight, out of mind, but when they are in sight, they don't evoke compassion and empathy. they evoke horror and fear that's been programmed into us by media for, decades. So the uphill battle is to try to transform, that apathy into empathy, right? Or that ignorance, and really invoke a sense of understanding. And so film is a really powerful medium because it bypasses sort of our programming, our mind programming, and goes straight to our heart. It's sort of, if you do it right, it sort of sparks that childhood, excitement or interest or curiosity or empathy. And for Mako Sharks in particular, that was a huge challenge because in all honesty, I was a bit scared of them. And I'm the guy who goes out there beating the drum.
You dive with every shark under the sun, surely you.
I've been out of the cage with 15-foot great whites. And I'm out there beating the drum, sharks don't want to eat you and all that. And I just remember I pulled up with Riley in New Zealand, and we put our boat, dropped a little bit of, a little tuna head on a rope, and that was it. And this Mako shark comes ripping in, doesn't even look at the tuna head, comes to the step, puts its head out of the water, and I'm standing on the swim step, and starts munching at my feet. And I jump back in the boat, and then it goes and it turns and it starts trying to eat the outboard engine off the back of the boat, right? And I'm thinking, okay, this is going to be a harder job than I thought. Like, how am I going to get anyone to want to protect the shark that tries to eat your boat? And we slowed everything down, and we waited for about a half an hour, and we just let this animal circle in its range, and then all the energy shifted. And I remember we eventually slipped into the water, and I imagined that it was going to do the same thing and come just straight at us. But no, it turned. Deliberately, it looked me straight in the eye, and they had these beautiful, large, dark orbital eyes. And it just hovered slowly in, and it stopped within inches of my camera, and then just grazed right by the lens, and it was just staring at me the entire time. And that was it. After that, it circled us for hours. You could, if you wanted, you could have petted it. We didn't, but you could have. And it was circling our feet and all that. And I realized that this is a formidable predator, but really what it is it's establishing its territory, and it's trying to figure out, am I foe or food, or neither? And they're intelligent animals, and very quickly it determined that I was certainly nowhere a match for it from a competitive standpoint. I'm like a wounded dolphin in the water, right? And I certainly wasn't food because I'm covered in neoprene and I don't look anything like it. And I didn't make myself act like food. And so it was like, okay, I can share the water. And I figured if in that very short moment, I could transform my entire perception of this animal, right? If we could get a story behind it, get the visuals behind it, and get sort of stories from fishermen and other people who have interacted with it, we could help bring that empathy that I was now experiencing to the public. And that's when I realized we had a chance, because in that one moment it switched for me, and I knew we could switch it for other people by bringing that message and that visual storytelling to the table.
I know the exact feeling when I many moons ago, when I first started working in shark conservation. I left university and went out to Bimini, the shark lab, sort of a very eager beaver, much younger person than I was now. Couldn't wait to get in the water with sharks. I was single-handedly going to save them all, as as everyone who goes out to Bimini was like. I jumped in the water, and a small, and I would say about this size, sharp nose swam underneath me with a foot, and I thought, what the heck am I doing here? I'm going to get eaten. So even someone who kind of had set out on this path, you have that innate inbred fear. So and I was watching your film just before come on this session, and the footage with the Mako Sharks is some of the most relaxing footage you can watch. It's if you even forget the message, you want to watch something relaxing, I urge you to watch the films, to just watch these animals sort of slowly check Shawn out. We've got some questions coming in. One for you, Shawn, from David Maguire from Shark Stewards. I'll read this out.
Hey, David.
Shawn, can you speak to the cultural connections to the Mako Sharks and how that influences conversations about these sharks? And then we got a question for you to follow that, then, Lee.
That's actually a great question, because one of the reasons we chose New Zealand, not only because it has one of the most healthy remaining Mako shark populations that we know about, which is important, and there's progress happening right now in New Zealand on that front, actually, but there was a strong Maori cultural connection to the Mako shark. It's sort of the protector of their canoes and the protector of their seas. And I wanted to uncover a bit more about that. And it's interesting because sort of in the younger generation, some of that story had actually been lost. But as I moved into some of the older community generations, into some of the leaders within the communities, tribal leaders, there was a really strong connection, and you can see it in their art and their paintings and in some of their jewelry, carved bone and stuff. They had Mako sharks, and back a long time ago, they would go out in their canoes, and very occasionally they would catch a Mako shark, right? And they would perform this really elaborate ceremony, and then they would bring it back. They'd feed the entire village. But it was absolutely taboo to intentionally harm these animals without doing a ceremonial process. And then what happened is, as fisheries transformed and it became industrialized, it flew right in the face of their traditions, because hundreds, if not thousands, of these animals were being landed in New Zealand waters in these tuna longline fisheries. And before the shark fin ban, they were all being kept. And largely the fins were being hacked off, the bodies dumped, and those fins were being traded in Asia. And it was only when they put in the shark fin ban that that whole issue came to light and more focus came on the species. And so the cultural connection is really important, because as I've traveled the world, I learned that sharks, because they are formidable and they do keep the ocean in balance, there's a strong sort of cultural connection to the role of the shark as an apex predator in being a protector. Not a villain, but actually a protector of the seas. And so I think bringing your storytelling back to that has been a really powerful element, because it is the storytelling process that we use even in this day and age. When you go on holiday, you don't just give bullet points, you tell the experiences. And that's what people really gravitate towards. So bringing that cultural storytelling was a really key element to helping people understand how important these animals were, not just from an environmental perspective, but also from a societal level.
Absolutely, and I've seen that myself prior to joining Project Aware. I was lived in Fiji working on shark conservation in the South Pacific, and the cultural connection of sharks and the charismatic megafauna is instrumental. Where you've got, people say they're small island states, but they're large oceanic states. And what I saw, and it was the CITES meeting before the last one, so that was 5 years ago in South Africa. And one of the contentious kind of species that were iconic were talking about elephants and the African species that a lot of African nations kind of held culturally the big five, and the small Pacific island delegations were said, we have a big five, we have a similar big five. You have sharks, you have dolphins, you have whales, you have turtles, and you have manta rays. Mm-hmm. So these things have huge, deep cultural connections. You look at the Cook Islands, sharks are on there's a cultural story about I believe it's the fairy Princess Ina who caused the hammerhead shark to have her hammerhead shape is on the money. And in French Polynesia, we were working with communities that were overfishing a reef, and reef shark populations were declining, but the reefs were in sort of the cultural aspects. The reef was where, when a village elder passed away, they would put the body into the reef, and the sharks would consume the body, but they'd be the conduit from life into the afterlife. And when we started working with philanthropists and social scientists, we changed the messaging to talk about how, if these reefs aren't protected and the sharks aren't protected, you're almost losing the connection for the ancestral passage. And the minute you had that cultural connection, it's a whole different understanding, and that gets lost a lot sometimes, especially from a Western culture, as three Western people kind of sit there talking about conservation. Sometimes conservation for the sake of conservation is not the message to get across. Lee, I've got a question for you.
Okay.
This is anonymous. I don't know who this is coming in from. There was an attempt to list blue sharks at the last convention, but it was stopped according to the US because 20 million shark fin trade annually. Is there any movement to reapply listing of blue sharks under CITES that you know of? Drifting away from Mako's a little bit, but it's a question.
Yeah, I mean, the big push last time, this is August of 2019, was to get short and long fin Mako listed, and then wedgefish and guitarfish. So it was a total of 18 species. I'm not really aware that, I don't recall if there was an effort to do a listing of blue sharks then.
There wasn't.
Yeah. So, but, you know, I think it's the conservation community's evaluating proposals right now for species to propose for listing at the next CITES meeting, which will be, well, it was supposed to be in March of 2022 in Costa Rica, but that is now off the table, and they're looking at July-ish in Geneva, where CITES is headquartered. But there's also, you know, maybe another country is going to host it, so it may get pushed back even later. So we'll see. But I think it's a little premature right now to be speculating about, you know, which species might be listed or proposed for listing. I would just say that as far as I know, everything's on the table. So, you know, they're looking at a lot of different species, and certainly blue sharks. If you look at the Hong Kong fin trade and the species composition, they're about 40% of the Hong Kong fin trade is blue sharks. So it's a major species in fisheries around the world. And just one thing on blue sharks that I just saw a report that WWF Portugal put out, and they were looking at the Portuguese shark fisheries. And one of the things that was really interesting, in not in a good way, was that there's longline fisheries for, and we talked about this for tunas and swordfish and things like that. So a long line is this surface line that can be up to 30, 40 miles long. There's hooks that hang off it. It's, you know, maybe 1,000 hooks, and they're baited with you know, fish meat and things like that. So they're pretty good at catching sharks. They also catch, you know, a variety of turtles and seabirds and a variety of other things. They're really indiscriminate types of fishing, and they have high levels of what's called bycatch, or, you know, unintentional, you know, inadvertent catch. You know, but because of the way they fish, I mean, that's the cost of doing business. That's the collateral damage of using that type of gear, as a lot of other animals get killed as part of it. But anyway, this WWF Portugal study found that that the blue shark catch in this longline fishery for swordfish was 3 times greater than the swordfish catch. So really, it's a blue shark fishery with swordfish as a bycatch. But you know, it just goes to show you that how many when you start looking at these longline fisheries for tunas and billfish and swordfish, you know, they're huge catch of sharks in that. And the thing that's really also about this, I just checking my notes so I don't misstate this. 91% of those blue sharks were immature.
Yeah.
They also looked at short fin mako. 86% of those that they saw were immature. So that is by no means a sustainable fishery. I mean, that cannot go on. I mean, you're just taking the capital out of the bank, and it's just not going to last if we keep doing it. So that's really a sign of trouble.
So that kind of corroborates what you were saying earlier, Shawn, that you were seeing fewer and fewer big sharks. So when you first started cataloging things.
Yeah, I would add, because Lee makes an incredible point there about what is the composition of these landings, right? I was in Kesanuma, Japan in 2010 documenting their tuna fishery. And in a single day, they landed 6,500 blue sharks. Do you know what 6,500 sharks looks like on a single factory floor? There were 200 Mako sharks and there were 100 tuna. And this was a tuna fishery, literally listed as a tuna fishery.
Yeah, there you go.
And of the Mako sharks, of the 200, 1 was a mature female. The other 199 were all less than 2 meters long. And I just looked in shock. And so we, through our translator, we spoke to some of the factory workers, and they said, back in the day, they used to catch a lot more tuna. They didn't even keep the blue sharks, but they landed these huge Mako sharks, and they all looked as big and a lot bigger than that one female. And over a dozen years, the composition had shifted to almost no tuna, massive amounts of immature to slightly mature blue sharks, and the virtual disappearance of Mako sharks in the composition of their catch. And so when we look at these shark species from a deserving standpoint to be protected, you know, we need to protect so many more. It's really about a triage battle right now. what is the most pressing one that we need to get protected right this moment? And there's only so much bandwidth. And so I think the question is not whether blue sharks or any sharks deserve protection. It's like, which is the most pressing one that we can get through next? And in the last 10 years, I think there were only, before 2009, I think there were only 3 shark species protected. And Lee, correct me if I'm wrong, but aren't we at 40 or 44 now?
46.
Yeah, 46. So we've made a tremendous progress, I think, in the last 10 years. And CITES has become an incredible tool to at least begin a deep conversation about shark conservation. And I think Lee's going to talk a little bit later about how that actually flows into real conservation.
Yeah, well, I've got a follow-up for you, Lee. I've got some questions coming in, but I've got one myself, maybe slightly loaded. So, you know, the Mako sort of successful listing on CITES was a win for Makos. Can we all now, from a conservation perspective, all sit back and say, job done, or is there anything left to do for them?
Talk about a leading question here. No, there is a lot of work to be done. The listing is the first step. It's the first step, and it opens up all the tools of CITES to driving better Mako management or any of the shark species that are listed. Shawn alluded to this. We were talking the other day about this, but we're already seeing some positive impacts from the listing of Mako on CITES Appendix 2 in the EU, in Europe. As I said, one of the first things that a country has to do, or in this case the EU, is their scientific authority has to do this assessment of the fishery and the trade and determine whether it's going to be detrimental to the species in the wild. So they just did this in the scientific committee for the EU did this for Mako, and they came out with a negative determination. It's not sustainable. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature in 2019 just completed a reassessment of Makos, which said that, in the Atlantic, there had been a 60% decline. I mean, they're in bad shape. They listed them as endangered on their red list. So what flowed from that negative NDF was, because over 90% of the Mako catch that goes into Europe is caught on the high seas, it's considered exported into the EU, and therefore needs a permit from CITES to be able to export it. So without the positive NDF, they can't get that permit, so they can't land these Mako sharks they catch on the high seas. And what that led to in February was both the Spanish government and the Portuguese government establishing 0 quotas for Mako. So the 2 biggest Mako fishing countries in Europe, 0 quota for Mako, and that's directly flows down from the listing and then the implementation of that listing. The question is going to be now, what happens with, we talked about ICAT, the International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tunas, and you've been involved in this, and that group you're working with has been involved in this for years. Scientific advice on Mako for that group is there should be a retention ban. Fishermen shouldn't be able to keep Mako sharks. And there's been proposals the last 2 meetings to implement that. They've drawn wide support. Even the Japanese and the Taiwanese and the Chinese have supported it, and they're not historically great fish conservation nations. But surprisingly, the opposition came from the EU and the United States. They were the 2 entities that blocked this for 2 years in a row. So we're hopeful that this, negative NDF for Mako in Europe is going to cause the EU to change its position at ICAT, and hopefully, with a change of administration here in the United States, we're going to see the U.S. Change its position as well. But you're on the wrong side of history if you're opposing a conservation measure that's supported by Japan, Taiwan, and China. Hopefully they see the light and get on.
The Mako shark is quite an interesting case study on shark conservation. Was a lot of people, there's a lot of films coming out, a lot of controversial documentaries coming out recently, which do have the narrative of, that Asian nations are, decimating seas, but the Mako shark, it's not the Asian nations, it's the US and the European Union in the Atlantic that are overfishing, which is kind of almost contradictory from a storytelling perspective. Shawn, I've got a question from Beth, who's a 7th grade science teacher, kind of potentially following on a little bit from narratives. She's asking, she's covering human impact in her classroom in the 7th grade. She wants to know, what message do you think is most important for her to impart to her 7th grade class regarding this conservation and conservation in general and ocean conservation?
It's a great question. I think there's a personal ownership and empowerment message that is more important than ever. I think a lot of people, you just switch on the news, right? And nowadays your news is on your phone 24/7. It's on your computer, it's pouring in from your friends. And from an environmental perspective, largely it's pretty depressing. We're not getting a lot of wins that we need, and or we're holding ground and slipping backwards slowly in many cases. And so it's very easy to throw up your hands and say, hey, just live it up while you can, and we'll deal with it later. But the fact of the matter is, every single day, each and every one of us is voting. We're voting with the money we spend, the things we consume, our diets, how we dispose of things. And I think the message to the children is that you have a say in this. We haven't done a great job of ensuring their future from a natural world perspective. In fact, I think we've done a pretty poor job. And when I have 2 daughters, and when they want something, they're very vocal about it. And generally, they're pretty persuasive in getting their way. If they take that same tenacity and put it towards the environmental issues, and in my day, you had to read a life book that was often years old, or watch a David Attenborough show that came every few months or every once a year. Now that information is available right there in front of them, and they can become really knowledgeable and very powerful advocates for environmentalism. And to take that voice and bring it to the house. And one of the first things you can change in your house is what's going into your mouths, what you're eating. And sustainability is a really important issue right now. And I think obviously with some of the films that have come out recently, there's a strong question mark on that. And there should be. We need to challenge and we need to ask those questions. But at least take the steps to ensure that what you're consuming is doing the least harm possible, that you're okay with. And when it comes to protecting sharks, largely they're victims of our tuna fisheries and other fisheries. And there's pole caught tuna, and there's longline and purseine and all these massive industrial versions of fishing. So doing your best to ensure that if you're gonna eat fish, that it comes from the most sustainable source that you feel comfortable with is a huge starting point. And then second, if you're going to eat meat, know that 40% of the fish coming out of the ocean is going to feed livestock. Well, that's a huge caloric loss in the process, let alone a travesty, right? So make a really conscious decision about what you're doing from a dietary perspective. And once you feel comfortable that what you're eating is okay with you, be that for your community. Talk to your parents if you're a kid and tell them, hey, we can do better, because we won't have a world to sustain us if we don't. So I think kids are probably one of the most powerful weapons of mass construction, and they just need to let their voices be heard.
I agree. I've got a 9-year-old daughter myself. I know that her and her classmates, they're the people you need to convince the least about the future of the planet. They're the mini activists who are, taking part in all the rallies and badgering teachers to kind of embed conservation into a lot of the what they're doing. I've got a slight change of tack. We've got Rebecca from Kentucky, who's going to try and catch both of you out. I know the answer to this question, but I'm going to try and let you two. She's testing your shark taxonomy knowledge. She wants to know, are Makos cousins of the lesser known and much smaller poor beagle shark?
You mean, are they in the same family?
We'll accept that as a
Well, salmon sharks and poor beagle sharks certainly are. Are they Mako sharks in the same?
Are they lamnids?
I'm gonna have to.
I want to say yes.
You're right. Yes. No, Rebecca, that was a great question. That question that taxonomist. I know the taxonomist who to send you to. I'll send you that. But yes, they are there in the laminate family.
You can tell them all because their teeth hang out of their mouth. Very scary looking.
So, Shawn, I wanted to kind of take you back to the film and the film process. And obviously now we've, as we're getting more films, especially with the Attenborough films on BBC go well, a lot of the mystique of the filmmaking process is kind of shone some light on. They show the processes behind it. I'd like to ask you, do you go out, and especially with this film, well, not necessarily just this film, but do you go out with a shot that you want to get in mind, or do you go out more along the lines of, let's see what we get and see how we can put this together into a narrative?
Wow, that's a great question. I think the answer is yes and yes. There's a vision, right, of that moment. And you film for hours and days and sometimes weeks, right? But there's what I call this sort of the point of the spear. It's that one singular moment that changes everything for you and hopefully the audience, right? And you think about the greatest films you've watched, there's that moment, right? Yeah. And so for the Makos, I had the vision of this moment where I came eye to eye with this animal, and you didn't see a monster. You saw something deep in its soul. You saw something mysterious. You saw something curious and also vulnerable. And so, yeah, I wanted that moment. And, I know folks that do some shark photography and they love to get the teeth on the camera and all that. You have to work hard to get a shark to do that. If you relax and really settle into its presence and let it do its thing, and then you be the quiet observer, they behave entirely differently. And so I wanted to see if I really surrendered as the quiet observer, what kind of being showed up, and did it do that? And so, yes, I wanted to get that moment, but at the same time, I knew very little about this shark. Very few people have a lot of knowledge, in-water knowledge of this shark, let's just say. And I was working with, like I said, Riley, who's been working with him for a decade. And something that's really important to me is when I work with people who have local expertise, though I've done 12 years of white sharks and dozens of years of tigers, every shark is different, every location is different, every situation is different. I surrender to the local knowledge, and then I surrender to the animal. And so in the water, I was just as curious to see what would actually happen, right? And I wanted to tell the truth. And fortunately, the truth was this animal was probably one of the most sentient and curious of sharks I've ever experienced. It instantly went to my favorite shark. And I have a lot of favorite shark animals in the ocean, and it just went zhink. And because it had such immense power and such a formidable predator. I saw one of these Makos when we were filming in the water, swimming along, and then a bigger Mako, like a 12-foot Mako, came launching from the depths and pile drived into it and sent it flying in the air, right?
Wow.
And I realized in that moment that these sharks could do that to me in a moment, because they're designed to take a 1,000-pound marlin and hit it at speeds of 60 miles an hour, and with their ferocious teeth, rip its tail off, turn around, bite it in the neck, and instantly kill it, right? So it is one of the most scary sharks you could ever come face to face. In fact, having swum with a great white, nowhere near as ferocious as a Mako. Slower, more methodical, all those things. But this Mako shark, wow. And to then go in the water and surrender to its world, and realize that if I did not agitate it, if I allowed it to be the dominant animal in the system, it accepted us completely. And I remember we swam with one Mako shark for 6 hours. We pulled the bait out of the water in the first hour. For 5 hours, this animal kept company with us, and not once did it ever even try to mouth me, bite me, or anything like that. It just kept coming close to the point where it would take its lateral line, which is this sensory node along the side of the shark, if people don't know, and would rub right against my shoulder every time it came by. And I realized there was this sort of cross-species connection happening there. I'm not someone who says, go out in the ocean and jump in the water with a Mako shark. Don't do that. But if you actually allow it with from a professional perspective to get in there and really focus on letting it do its thing, you will discover one of the most incredible animals I've ever experienced in the oceans. Mind blowing.
And I sort of follow up from the film. I know so films and documentaries almost sort of have a fleeting kind of quality about them. So, sometimes they're made, they create a big buzz, and then, as they move into history, they get taken by the next thing. How do you build in sort of a longevity to the kind of the films that you develop?
I think the conservation outcome is the byproduct of the film. So, the CITES element of this film came right at the back end.
Yeah.
Now, I really want the viewers to form their opinion based on the storytelling, the imagery, but also experts, people who have worked with these animals, and the facts, right? And nothing in this film is dated in the fact that, yeah, it takes almost 20 years for a female Mako to reach sexual maturity. She only has, 4 to 12 pups every 18 to 24 months if she doesn't get killed. And, there was a scientific study done. They tagged a group of Mako sharks. In the first year, 30% of them died in long-line fisheries. Well, if those numbers held, in 3 years, that all that population that you tagged would be gone. And those types of numbers suggest that we've got to move fast to protect these animals. And so, as Lee basically laid out, CITES is sort of an opening of a global conversation that then spurs all kinds of opportunities, whether it be national protections that are being proposed in certain countries, whether it be zero retention that is being proposed in entire ocean fisheries, right? And so this film has the opportunity to be resurfaced and reused because it presents human stories of connection with scientific data to support the ongoing conservation of these animals.
You raise a good point, and actually it's segues nicely into a question we've got for Lee from Nasiba. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name. Lee, are you able to talk more about the implications for a country that ratified the CITES Convention but has failed to follow the rules of CITES?
Well, ultimately, there's, as I said before, there's that opportunity for a ban on all listed species, the trade in all listed species in those countries. Before that happens, they would typically go through something called a review of significant trade, where they're going to look at countries that are trading a lot of listed species and take a look at their non-detriment finding and their management measures. Also, they're going to look at countries that are not, they may say they've established a trade ban, but the trade data indicates there's listed species still being traded, so there's illegal trade going on. Or there's a suspicion that the NDF is not being implemented properly, because they typically contain management measures, things that the country's going to do to better manage their sharks. So all those things could trigger this review of significant trade, and what comes out of that is recommendations for the country to improve its management. So the trade ban is the last straw, the hammer at the end of it. So there's opportunities along the way to help countries do a better job. And so what we're funding is exactly that kind of work. We're providing capacity and information to, like I said, 20 countries around the world through NGOs and that are working in those countries. And the Food and Agriculture Administration provides support. Some governments also provide support. So there's financial resources out there and technical resources out there to help countries comply. I just wanted to mention one thing that I think is really important about Shawn's film that we haven't had a chance to talk about yet is, how it was used for changing management, how it was used to help get the CITES listing, which wasn't it was a difficult slog, and it you need a 2/3 majority at CITES, and it passed with I think a 7-vote margin, which is pretty close. And I wonder if, Shawn, you could talk a little bit about what you did in that regard, and particularly about Canada. And that, I think that's really interesting and important work that you did on piggybacking on the film.
I'm really glad you raised that point. We don't solve these issues with a singular moment. We can start a conversation, we can begin an initiative, but it takes a really concerted effort. It takes strategy and structure, and it takes a global team. and especially for CITES, right? We're talking about coalitions of people working across the world that work in the NGO space, they work in industry, they work in policy, bringing those people together and helping them become part of the campaign and the solution to make that victory happen, right? And for filmmakers, I think a piece of advice I'd give is don't think of your film as the end of the process. Think of your film as the beginning step or an intermediary step in the process, but it's a step. And so the process that we did with the Mako Sharks was we looked at this as a core piece of content to support an ecosystem of conservation. And a big piece of that was the outreach, a really unified cross-NGO effort to get a message across to a community of it was time for change and action was needed urgently. And that involved a full social media push in multilingual, multi-country, reaching not only just consumers, but really the policymakers who are huge consumers now of social media messaging, and letter writing campaigns, and ultimately culminating in a petition and a push to really get it over the finish line. And Lee mentioned Canada, and it's interesting because Canada is one of the countries that has large interactions with Mako sharks in their fisheries. It's happening in their swordfish fishery. I think it's happening in a few others as well. And initially there was some resistance to the listing, and it's hard when you bring a species to the table and some of the most wealthy, most scientifically informed nations are in opposition. And this has happened in some recent years, and it's almost mind-boggling, you know, with the US opposing what's happening right now with ICAP. And we saw a couple of countries right on the borderline of yes or no, and the vote came down to 7, right? So we didn't win by a landslide this time. We needed every single vote, especially the ones that were on the margin. And in particular, Canada had an opportunity to not be sort of the villain in this, but to say, hey, enough is enough. And even though we have fisheries interactions and it's going to be a bit complicated and maybe some money will be lost, it's the right thing to do. And so we initiated a public campaign, as well as calling in some of the people who are business. You know, Richard Branson made a personal call to the ministry and really said, hey guys, you know, Rob Stewart's from your country, you know, Mr. Sharkwater, what are you doing for sharks in this vote? And so between sort of the letter writing and the petitions, you know, the country did the right thing. And it's not always, you know, sometimes people aren't always on the right side of the issue. That doesn't make them bad. It just means there's a lot of considerations that they haven't yet really put to the forefront. And in this case, Canada moved their position. They took a strong stand in favor. A number of the countries that were waiting on the margins to see what to do came in line, and the team managed to work with the representatives. And I just remember the moment where it went ding, ding. And it was like, wow, there was no I in that process. There was a massive global we. Right. We did it.
I think it's Canada's a really interesting study to show that this kind of follows on from Beth, the 7th grade teacher was asking about how can you kind of get the message across to students. But we mustn't also forget the power that every single person has. So people often forget that as sharks, they're caught in fisheries. Fisheries are a public resource. They belong to the public. They're managed by government officials who are public servants using public money to manage a public resource. So the more interaction and the more vocal noise is made from members of the public to their government representatives to say, hang on a second, why are you not managing my resource in my interest? That message often gets lost. And I say from Canada, who were, as I know, were on the fence on Makos at CITES, they are now actually leading to stop Mako retention in Atlantic. They're, along with Senegal, Canada are putting forward proposals to end the retention of overfished Makos in Atlantic, and are being opposed by people who supported the CITES proposal, the EU and the US. So the roles are flipped. But the more public support we get to push government officials to do the right thing, the more it can't be ignored. I've got a couple of questions, and they obviously, being a film festival, they'll be aimed at you, Shawn. First one is, what can you tell us what your next film is about? Or is there one in the pipeline?
There's several in the pipeline. You know, one thing about conservation is you never run out of work. Lee knows that. It's like backlog.
Yeah.
It's like the tip of the iceberg, right? Here's Mako's, here's the rest of the ocean, here's the rest of the world, right? So we're working on a number of really important initiatives. And again, people often say, what's your next film? But really it's what's your next project? What's your next conservation outcome, right? And so for me, one of the areas that we're retaining a spotlight on is West Papua, a region in far eastern Indonesia. It's the heart of the ocean, the epicenter of biodiversity. And we've made massive progress towards creating the first conservation province in all of Southeast Asia and protecting up to 70% of virgin rainforest, 50% of the reef systems, the vast majority of all the virgin mangroves, which 10% of the world's mangroves are in this one area. And so we're working on a film project right now to gather some huge global support to endow that initiative, to ensure that it finishes, because we've got the legislation in place, which is the policy win. Now we need the implementation. Another area that's a huge focus is Baja California, Mexico, BCS, Southern Baja California Sur. And in the last year, I've spent a good deal of time working in that area. It's got 6 of the world's 8 turtle species. It's got blue whales and fin whales and humpback whales and Brutus whales and, you know, dolphins and whale sharks and manta rays and Mako. It's literally, I think Jacques Cousteau called it the aquarium of the ocean, but it's also been hammered by fisheries. And there's a massive initiative underway right now to return it to its sort of prior state of artisanal fisheries as the priority and large protected areas. So that, again, the communities that live there benefit versus outside communities coming in with large vessels and scooping up everything. And so we have a major program that we're launching down there. And I'm really excited. And there's going to be films as a part of that initiative. There's going to be storytelling. And we've already been hinting at it. But in the coming months, you know, keep your eye on that screen, because there's some really exciting things coming.
It sounds like you got not much time to put your feet up then and relax. And we're just sort of obviously coming to the end of this session. So I'm, as moderator, I'm going to take my right as having the question again. Is for you, Shawn. We've talked a lot about fishing and longline fishing, and I can see a longline hook around your neck. I'm hoping it's deliberately meant to be there and not something you had noticed. Is there a story? There must be a story behind that, surely.
Yeah, it's actually very personal to me. I had the humbling experience to work with the Marviva patrol team down in Cocos Island, which is a World Heritage Site 300 miles off the coast of Costa Rica in the Pacific. And when I was there working with them, though it was a national protected area, World Heritage Site, every single day, 40 longline vessels came into the park, would drop lines that they would submerge just below the surface with slightly flooded buoys and let them float through the park, and they would catch everything in their path. I estimated there was 1,000 miles of line going through the park every night. And these poor rangers would go out every night and they would try to chase them out of the park. And I mean, it was like, it wasn't hurting sheep. It was like one sheepdog trying to fend off 100 wolves, right? It was, the odds were stacked against them. And, you know, they did this day after day, month after month, year after year. And I was out there just for a short period of time, and we'd pull 7 to 8 hours a day of long line and 40 to 50 miles of it. And on one of the lines, and there were a lot of dead animals, mostly dead animals. But on one of them, there was this really tired 7-foot female silky shark. And I remember I was in the water filming it, and they pulled it upside of the boat, and we took pliers and we worked the hook out of its mouth. And I remember filming as it tiredly sort of started to move back in its body, and then it sort of swam off and then disappeared in the depth. And for me, it was like, wow, in the face of these insurmountable odds, right? Like just the world pressing in on this one sacred place and a species that was being hammered, we saved this one shark. And for every single one we save, it matters. And I took that hook, and I remember it was razor sharp. You can't, it's very different now. I shaved it down and I put it on a strap, and I stapled it around my neck. And that was 12 years ago. And it's been around my neck every single day for the last 12 years. And it's my totem. It's my reminder that we need to do it, even if we can save one, because imagine if you're that one, it matters. but it's also been a protectorate for me. And I've had at least 5 instances where it saved my life, literally, where I had machetes at my throat in Ecuador, or I had military after me in Southeast Asia.
It sounds like a Q&A session on its own, Shawn.
Yeah. But when they caught up to me, I pulled my cover, which was an internationally renowned sport fisherman hook, and I'd give him a big smile. And, you know, in Latin America, it was.
Oh, well, seem to be.
My neck's still here, right? So, you know, hey, if it works on that, I'll tell you what, I would keep it around your neck.
Well, thanks very much. So, gents, I would like to thank you both. We've come to the end of our time. Shawn, thank you. Lee, thank you very much.
Sure. Hey, Ian, can we, aside from what Shawn talked about as far as, you know, how you live your life, I think there's opportunities, isn't there, to help out with this Mako campaign at ICAT. And I think we're going to put a link to a place where people can take action.
We are. In fact, if any of you who are listening, if you, on your favorite search engine, many are available, if you just type in the Shark League, it will take you to a link of the work that Project Aware are doing. And our partners, Shark Advocates International, the Shark Trust, and the Ecology Action Centre. And we're working on the Mako overfishing issue in the Atlantic. Is a really important issue. There are 52 countries, so this is not just confined to 1 or 2 countries. There are 52 countries that fish in the Atlantic. So please go onto the sharkleague.org. If you just type that into Google, it'll take you to the website. It'll give you an issue. It'll tell you if your country is a supporter of it, and if it's not, it'll tell you if your country's not said anything at all. And please get in touch with us, and we can help you. And like you say, must remember that sharks are they're a natural resource being managed by taxpayer dollars, by public servants. So let us help you to put the pressure where it's needed. And thank you for that reminder, Lee. Like I say, for those of you, the festival has got another few days to continue. So the 2nd of May, I believe, is the last day. I urge you all to check out Shawn's film, The Mako Stronghold. I talked about the lateral line. There's a great close-up of the Mako shark. You see all its features close up, and it's a beautiful thing to watch. So thank you very much, gents, and thank you all for your questions and for joining us.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.